On episode 385 of the 40 Plus Fitness Podcast, we meet Dr. Marc Bubbs and discuss his book, Peak. You can find the full show notes for this episode at 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/385. Have you decided you're ready to make a change? To reclaim your health and fitness? The 40 Plus Fitness Podcast is here for you. I'm your host, Alan Meisner. I'm an NSAM certified personal trainer with a specialization in corrective exercise and fitness nutrition. Let me be your coach as you find your way on your health and fitness journey. All right, let's go. Our guest today is a naturopathic doctor that's been working with athletes and active people for more than 2 decades. He's worked with most of the major sporting leagues out there, so this guy really knows his stuff. Today, we're going to talk about his book, Peak, and it's about athletic performance. But I think the way I look at it, athletic performance is the same as performing the normal daily things that you do in your life. So if you want to perform better at just being you, you're going to get a lot out of this episode. So our guest today, his name is Dr. Marc Bubbs. With no further ado, here is Dr. Marc Bubbs. So Dr. Bubbs, welcome to 40 Plus Fitness.
Alan, thanks so much for having me on.
You know, occasionally I will run into a book. Your book is called Peak, The New Science of Athletic Performance That is Revolutionizing Sports. And like I said, I run into a book and I start reading it, and then the author cites a study. And so now I'm on Dr. Google, I'm on Google trying to read that study. So then I read the study abstract and I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. So then I pull up the actual study and I start to read the actual study. Then I get back into the book and I read a little bit further and I find another one. I'm like, ooh. So,
there's lots of opportunities for that with this.
Yes, there is. This was a very well-researched book. And the research that you went to, I was actually pleasantly surprised that it was really good research. It was not this put together by by Gatorade, and they're trying to advertise their sports drink. These were good, solid studies that really do back the science of this book. And so I was really impressed with the citations. And I have to admit, because I usually read all of every book before I do an episode, but I've still got a ways to go on yours because I'm learning new things pretty much every page I turn.
Oh, no problem. Well, listen, I appreciate that. And definitely the book is all about connecting people with the experts in their respective fields in terms of not only athletic performance, but human performance in terms of just upgrading how you look, feel, and perform, and also providing people with just some general rules to follow, as well as what you just mentioned, which is that deep dive. If you do want to go down the rabbit hole, then there's lots of places that you can definitely do that as well.
Yeah. And I guess the other side of this is a lot of times people will sit there and we use the word performance. And yes, you're dealing with a lot of athletes and coaches and that type of thing. But in reality, the way I look at it is, human performance is just your ability to do the thing you want to do the best you possibly can. And a lot of the lessons that are here, that even though we're, in many cases, sometimes we're talking about those elite athletes, there are parallels to how we want to manage our health, in terms of longevity, in terms of capacity, and then just overall well-being.
100%. I mean, as you get to working with really elite athletes and professional Olympic level athletes, I mean, the level of training and the volume of training, the intensity of training is a tremendous load on the body, and it compromises health at that really elite level. And for folks who are just trying to improve their health or lose weight, or if they're struggling with whether it's weight gain, pre-diabetes, high blood pressure, those are big stressors on the body, and they're there 24/7. So even though it's coming from different areas, when you talk about human performance, the stress load can be just as high, if not higher, in folks that are struggling with their health as they are in athletes who are really pushing themselves.
Yeah, I mean, the statistics are baffling to me. Half the people in the United States have prediabetes or worse. The obesity rate and is just astronomical. So a lot of people right now are really struggling with their health. And I think it's just a common misconception of, I go in and get a blood test and the doctor tells me I'm fine. Because I had a consult I was doing just a week or so ago, and he told me he went to the doctor and his blood glucose levels, fasting blood glucose levels, were hovering right around 100. And I said, I think you should try to get that down closer to 80 and maybe even below 80 if you can. And he thought I was, a little weird. He's like, what are you talking about? My doctor says I'm fine. And I'm like, well, your doctor is looking at a reference range that includes a lot of sick people. And so he's getting you to what he's calling, average. And I think you want to get closer to optimal. So you introduced in the book a concept called the blood glucose dysfunction spectrum. And I really like that because it doesn't, it's not this, you're sick or you're healthy. It really kind of goes to that range of you're really, really sick, you're kind of sick, you're average, you're doing okay, and then your peak. Can you kind of talk about that spectrum and how it relates to us as humans being healthy and overall performance?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing is that, it's nothing inherently new in a sense, just looking at things in terms of a continuum. In science and in medicine, we have to define things. And so when we look at things like blood glucose dysfunction, we say, well, if you're less than 100 milligrams per deciliter, then you're considered normal. If your levels are between 100 and let's say 125 milligrams per deciliter, and of course, these are in U.S. Measurements, then you'd be considered pre-diabetic. Now that's a pretty wide range. And so this idea of continuum is, well, if you're 99, you're normal, but if you're 101, you're now pre-diabetic. That's a pretty small shift there. So we have to then consider that as you move up that chain, if you get above 125, then now you're considered diabetic. And so classically in medicine, we've said if you are type 2 diabetic, it is irreversible. It needs to be managed with medications, and therefore people tend to get put on medications for prolonged periods of time. Sometimes those medications, if they do need to take things like insulin, can make them gain more weight, which tends to make the process worse. But really, if we even zoom out just for a second to kind of look at the general population, this past summer I was in the UK and they had a picture of a beach from the 1970s because it was a heat wave this past summer in the UK. So they had a picture about 40, 50 years ago of a beach in the UK. And you literally, hundreds and hundreds of people in this photo, it was difficult to pick out anybody who was really overweight or obese, to almost impossible. Didn't look like anybody was. You fast forward, 40, 50 years later, and we're, 2/3 of the population now are overweight or obese. And you start to say, okay, well, what the heck's going on here? And there, of course, it's very complex and there are a lot of different reasons, but part of the book is we're trying to hammer on some of these bigger points. And one of the ones that really hits its home is the amount of household spending on what they call ultra processed food. The things that come in boxes and bags and junk food, so to speak. And if we look at the US and the UK, it's over 50% of what we buy comes in a box or a bag. When we think about the European countries, this is where it really stands out, because if you go to places like Spain, it drops all the way down to 20%. Places like France, 14%. Italy, classic Mediterranean diets in those regions, 13%. And when you get into places like Portugal, it's only 10%. And so this is really interesting because now we have this idea of effectively when you're eating processed food, you're getting stuff that's packaged, even things like cereals or packaged breads, pizzas, all that stuff comes from these types of foods. And that's an easy way for people to, if you start to limit some of those foods, you're going to reduce your total caloric intake. You're going to reduce typically your sugar intake, but also your intake of added fats in these foods as well. Because there's a nice, processed food companies are pretty smart. They make sure that combination of salt, sugar, and fat is just the right amount to really stimulate the brain, stimulate all the, the hunger and the thirst, and to make you want to eat more of it, right? That becomes interesting because obviously in the news now we see, is it sugar? Is it carbs? Then we have folks focusing on fat. And a lot of the newer research now coming out, a lady named Emma Stimson and her group there, the National Institute for Diabetes, in their research, they found that effectively it's the combination. So when you put high fat together with high sugar, which is again what you typically find in ultra processed foods, that was an independent predictor of weight gain and obesity and overeating. So those are some really big points to say, okay, this is one of our food environment plays a big role in this whole story. And if we come all the way back to that sort of idea of blood glucose dysfunction, this is where you'll find a lot of folks hovering up towards the top end of that range. So hovering up around 100, 110, 125. So that should definitely be a little bit of a yellow flag to say, or a red flag, if you will, to say, okay, we got to go back and look at what you're doing from a nutrition standpoint, but also things like exercise, things like sleep, things like stress. Those can also increase blood glucose levels as well. So just knowing where you are in that spectrum, and then comparing yourself to yourself year after year, rather than, as you mentioned, the general population, because unfortunately, you're comparing yourself to a group that aren't in the best of health.
Yeah, I know they'll do these studies sometimes, and they'll say, okay, well, what did you eat last week? And someone will go through and they'll kind of list it out. And I think if they actually truly logged what they ate, that they would find that they're in a box or a bag a lot more than they think. I'm here in Panama on an island, and I was thinking, okay, we have fresh produce. It's year round because the weather's great. It's moist, wet and rains. And I said, I'm going to have access to all kinds of fresh, healthy food. But there's all these supermarkets here that are catering to, the backpackers and the expats, and they're carrying the same bagged and boxed crap that I could get in the United States, and charging people a premium to have it. But
For sure.
People are buying it, and I think that's kind of the one of the core lessons as you come into this is, if you're finding yourself in that spectrum and you're moving up rather than at least maintaining or moving down, you're not doing what's best for yourself. And I like that in the book you were talking about, when you started talking about longevity, from an athlete's perspective, it's their ability to continue to perform at that high level. But it also involves our ability to live longer, and they're kind of follow the same track if we can keep ourselves where we're supposed to be. So can you talk about how this concept of blood glucose and our blood glucose levels, how that's affecting our longevity?
Definitely. I mean, that's one where, having some metrics and some markers to assess year in and year out of how you're doing is a really important thing. And fasting blood glucose can be a really nice one. And when we look at, mortality rates, what do people die of? What's the number one killer? And when we look at that, heart disease by far, almost 50%, it's about 41% of fatalities are from heart disease. So we say, okay, well, what happens then if you're a person whose blood glucose, as you mentioned, like your friend there, maybe you're in that 100 milligrams, 110, 125, or maybe you're even pre-diabetic. What does that tell us about some of your risks? Well, there was a large study done in the late 90s, a 22-year study on fasting glucose as a risk factor for your heart disease risk. And this was done in folks that were non-diabetic. And so in this one, if you were actually greater than 85 milligrams per deciliter, so you're in that upper quartile, that top fourth, you're actually at much greater risk, about a 40% higher risk than the other folks, the lowest folks in the study. So that's an issue around heart disease risk. A follow-up there that's called the Whitehall study that was also done on this connection between fasting blood glucose and cardiovascular disease. And what they found takes it a step further, because what they found is that as your fasting blood glucose increases, so does your risk of cardiovascular disease. So again, another really important point to kind of hammer home how this can be a decent metric for us to track. And interestingly, I found the strongest association was in 40 to 49-year-olds, which typically, obviously, as you get older, your risk increases. But one of the things that we tend to forget about is things like lack of sleep. If you don't sleep enough at night, the following morning, your blood glucose levels will tend to be higher. And if you do that persistently, then it can really lead to, causing you to have persistently higher blood sugar levels. You see this even if you do a lot of traveling, if you take a lot of planes for work, travel, jet lag, all that type of thing. You'll notice even if you do a blood test on the back end of that, your blood sugars will actually be higher than they normally would be. And that all comes down to this idea of, lack of sleep is a stressor as well. And so that's kind of the trickier one to put your finger on with folks is, that stress load in their life can be a key point as well in terms of how good their blood glucose control is. And for the athlete, that typically comes from intense training. And we see that as well. Athletes who are really fit, great blood glucose control. If we really push them hard, their fasting glucose in the morning will also be elevated. Now, in the acute term, that's not a problem. It's okay to have that happen. But if you're in a period where you're resting or you're deloading, if you're an athlete training, then it should come back down into this ideal range of, definitely less than 100 and ideally less than sort of 80, 85. That would be what we'd be looking for in those periods of rest. And I think for a lot of folks, sometimes when you get a few metrics done and you get a bit of testing done, that's when you can actually really you can put a number to things for people, and that really hammers home the idea of, okay, we got to go back to how you're eating, how you're moving, all these lifestyle factors, and figure out what are the biggest levers that you need to adjust to help improve your overall health, and as you mentioned, just improve your longevity, or what we call health span, which is the amount of years that you live in very good health, your total control of independence. Unfortunately, the last 8 to 10 years, the last decade of most people's lives is spent in pretty poor health and, requiring care, full-time care even. And so that's really what we want to strive for folks, is to be able to age healthily.
Yeah. And I think that was one of the kind of the big wake-up calls here, because, you hear a lot about particularly some elite athletes that really push themselves over the years, and how it adversely affects their health, and particularly longevity. But, you would think, okay, they're eating the best quality foods, and they're aware of the nutrition, and they got the right people behind them, making sure, of course, the glycemic index of their food is there, so they're not necessarily eating all the crap. But because of the way they're pushing their bodies, because they're not getting the sleep, because they're flying from East Coast to West Coast to play a game or be in a match or do an event, they're taking a toll on their health, and it's showing in their numbers. But if you were looking at it and just trying to reverse engineer and say, how did I get here? There's a lot more to it than just what you put in your mouth.
100%. And I think, one of the big differences as well is, as you mentioned, if somebody is physically fit, then what we're seeing is just an acute picture. And because they have such, greater resiliency, when they do take the stress load down, everything falls back into these sort of normal ranges or ideal ranges. Whereas unfortunately for a lot of folks, that stressor, that season doesn't end, so to speak, right? You're always going to have the long hours at the office. You're always not sleeping enough because of the kids or projects or family commitments. And so all of a sudden that becomes your chronic picture. And that's definitely when it's time to figure out how we can tweak your exercise program, or make sure you're getting sufficient sleep, and all these things that are real fundamental pillars, but they're oftentimes not quite as sexy as some of the new, whether it's a supplement or medication or trendy exercise that comes out that people tend to get their attention directed towards. But when you look at what the best in the world are doing, it really is just being excellent in the fundamentals.
Yeah, I like the story you shared about Federer, and how kind of maybe one of his secret weapons of how he came back and really started dominating again was just focusing on something as simple as getting enough sleep.
Yes, it's incredible. I mean, this was obviously the research on sleep in the last decade's really exploded. And in an interview I did with Dr. Shri Ma, who's a medical doctor and sleep expert who works in professional sport, and I had her on my podcast, and she was mentioning how he was definitely an early adopter, and for quite a while there was trying not to let the cat out of the bag, so to speak, because it was having some significant impact on his performance. And obviously now more people know about the benefits of sleep for performance in terms of things like reaction time, sprint speed, accuracy, all these types of metrics, but also for general population in terms of memory, cognitive function, absolutely crucial. The tricky part is, even despite everyone kind of knowing now that sleep's good for us, when you look at the numbers, we're still not getting enough. Even the athletes aren't getting enough. The average person gets 6.5 hours of sleep a night. 30% of the population get less than 6. And that's when things really start to nosedive. I mean, if you're getting less than 6, that's when the big flashing lights on the dashboard of your car start to go off. And, it's definitely time to check the engine or reboot a little bit.
Yeah. You, in the book, you introduced, it's a concept I've known about for a while, because obviously I'm talking to folks about this all the time. It's carbohydrate tolerance. And the gist of it, when I'm having a conversation with a client, would be, how many carbs should I have? And, I'd be like, okay, well, it depends, for me. And I'm like, depends. And they don't like that answer. But can you talk a little bit about carbohydrate tolerance and why what works for one individual may not work for another?
Yeah, this is definitely, nuance is definitely an area that's tricky for folks, because people want to have, especially when you're starting out, you want to have a nice, clear roadmap or plan of what I should do. And so if we look at an example of the popularity of low carb diets, something I use a lot in my clinical practice. Again, if we zoom out to 30,000 feet, what are the top 6 foods that people eat? Well, unfortunately, it's things like grain-based desserts, breads, soda pop, alcohol, pizza are 5 out of the top 6. And so that's where the bulk of your calories are coming from, that are going to impact ultimately how much weight you're gaining or how much weight you're losing. And so if we put somebody on a low carb diet, all of a sudden we cross off 5 out of the top 6 most calorically dense foods. And so that's a great way to help to support weight loss. You're basically directing people to eating more protein, to eating more vegetables, fruit, etc. And so that can be a great strategy for people to lose weight. And this idea of how many carbohydrates then, I mean, at the end of the day, it comes down to your total caloric intake. Now, the tricky part is, as I mentioned, the carbohydrates make up just so much of what's in our own food environment. So they're much easier to come by. And so this is where, for some people, the general rule we would say is the more activity you're doing, if you're an endurance athlete, you might get up to 8 to 10 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate, which is, you just imagine a guy riding in the Tour de France with a whole table full of pastas and breads and all these types of things, right? Just a ridiculous amount of food. But that could come all the way down to folks who are following more of a low carb keto approach, or maybe more sedentary, or have to work at a job where, they're not moving very much or sitting at a desk, and you might only be eating 50 grams instead of 850. And so that's the one that swings the most in terms of the amount that we can take in. What I try to do, and whether it's with athletes or with clients, is to first start with the protein intake. Protein has a lot of benefits in terms of, overall health, in terms of bringing on not only the essential amino acids you need, but also bringing on a lot of vitamins, minerals, nutrients. Really supportive in terms of weight loss because you get a bigger thermic effect. So it costs more energy for your body to break it down, which is beneficial. And it also tends to keep people full. And so if you can solidify somebody's protein intake and say, okay, we're going to consume, typically you don't always have to tell the clients how many grams per kilo, but you might say we're going to have 20 grams 3 or 4 times a day, or if they eat 3 meals a day, have about their palm size worth is about 25 to 30 grams. And then that way you've got the protein dialed in, they get used to that. They don't need to think about that. And all of a sudden it becomes easier to sort of turn these dials, if you will, the dials being fat intake and carbohydrate intake. And it really is different depending on the person, and depending on what the person likes to eat is important, because when we look at, the problem isn't taking weight off people. The real problem when we look at the research is keeping it off, right? Because 9 out of 10 people will regain it at the end of a year. So ultimately, you can do strategies in the short term that help you to lose weight, but ultimately you have to find a strategy that you enjoy enough to keep doing, right? Because compliance is the best predictor of how well you're going to do on a diet. So I try to tell clients, that first 4, 8, or 12 weeks, there might be some strategies that you've got to just grin and bear it and get used to it. And then as we move further down the road, we're trying to match up what you like to eat with your lifestyle, so we can support that longer term weight loss.
Yeah, I've found with a lot of my clients that if we go ahead and we introduce maybe some new foods that they haven't tried before, we take away quite a bit of foods that they typically enjoy, and they go for a little while, their palate kind of resets, the way they taste sweetness resets. And in many cases, what they used to not like, they now find themselves enjoying. And when they go back and try some of those things that they used to like, they taste the chemicals, they taste the ultra processed, and they don't like it nearly as much.
Absolutely, and I think that's one where in North America or in the West, breakfast is that meal that tends to be the one. If people are on the run, you're grabbing a coffee, and all of a sudden, all the options on the menu tend to be higher calorie, higher carb, and higher fat, right? So not the greatest combination. So yeah, if you can get people to have, basically protein and veg with some healthy fats, and then the amount of carbohydrate sort of depends on, the amount of weight you want to lose or how much activity you're doing. That can vary a bit in terms of if it's a very small to more moderate portion. And we typically try to time the carbohydrates around exercise too. If you're trying to get leaner, you still want to have a decent carbohydrate consumption, or you do want to enjoy some, sweet potato or whatever it may be, then having that before you do higher intensity sessions or directly after can be a nice strategy to help direct that into either being able to use it for fuel while you're training, or on the back end, as you've broken down your muscles in that training and used up the glycogen, which is the carb stores on the muscles, then the carbohydrates you're eating are going back into the muscles to top that up, which is a nice way to be able to recover from exercise.
Yeah, I definitely want to circle back around on this concept in a minute. But one of the things I did want to get in before we kind of leave this whole blood glucose dysfunction spectrum was the linkage between your blood glucose levels and depression. That kind of actually got me. I spent a lot of time looking at your research in that area, because it was I had not really thought about, obviously, you eat something and there's a kind of a mood effect to it because there's dopamine and everything's going on, but I had not really understood that connection before for the long-term actual diagnosis of depression. Could you kind of get into that?
Yeah, it's one that I started to see more and more in my practice. I deal a lot in men's health, and it was surprising to me the number of clients that were coming in that were taking medications that were, felt that they were struggling with low mood. And depression is defined as having low mood for greater than 12 months, and more patients were coming in. And it's when we look at markers like blood sugar levels, I mean, this is again this idea of trying to find the minimal amount of markers to follow that influence the most number of sort of systems or the most areas of the body. And when we start to look at the connection between blood sugars and mood, it gets to be pretty compelling. There's a lot of research coming out of Scandinavia around, HA1C levels, which is your HbA1c, which is your 3-month average of blood glucose. And so when that is higher, you're at a much greater risk of depression, as well as when you're fasting insulin. So insulin does a lot of things in the body, but it's typically classified as the blood sugar hormone, right? It's helping to get the food you eat into your cells. And when that's persistently high, it's also associated with, increased risk for depression. We see studies in military cadets as well. If you're, when you get yourself tested in the morning, if your fasting glucose and insulin is higher first thing in the morning, as well as post-meal, those are also predictive of depressive symptoms, more depressive symptoms. And for folks who are struggling with diabetes, we know that if you're insulin resistant, you're actually 3 times more likely to struggle with depression. So the really interesting thing is when we look at actually all those studies is medications don't alter any of those responses. So when we look at the general population, it's definitely one we want to make sure we're considering. And to your original point around just knowing where you are in that sort of continuum, or knowing what your number is for your blood glucose level, and we'll probably talk metrics here as we go, but HbA1c would be a good one to always have and typically run by your doctor. But that way and this isn't to say that just your blood glucose is the only factor that leads to low mood and depression, but it's definitely one that contributes. There's obviously all the psychosocial, emotional factors as well. But for me as a clinician or a nutritionist, it's always I'm trying to raise the playing field. So if I can get rid of or improve a blood sugar dysfunction, then it might be we're raising the playing field so that the cognitive behavioral therapy or whatever other talk therapy that the person might require, it's going to help them and improve their condition. And again, even if they're taking medications, we're still seeing improvements if we just help to correct the blood sugar dysfunction.
Yeah, that was just that. Like I said, that was so fascinating to me because I'd never really. I mean, like I said, I made the connection to food a little bit, but not to that level, which was, like I said, just really, really fascinating. Now, so someone decides, okay, I want to go ahead and get this tested. We've talked about fasting blood glucose levels. We've talked about, you said HbA1c. Typically we just say A1C. Yeah. Those are the common. What are some other tests that you think would be appropriate for someone that just kind of wants to get a good baseline to know that they're managing their carbohydrates appropriately?
Yeah, so those first 2 tests are typically run by most doctors. You could add fasting insulin to that. You typically have to ask your doctor. You probably have to pay out of pocket, but that's used in combination with fasting glucose to give you an assessment of your insulin resistance, a measure called HOMA-IR, which is a calculated measure. That gives you a bit of a deeper picture. None of these metrics are sort of infallible, or you can't hang your hat on just one, but it does give you another big piece of the puzzle to look at. A few more that I tend to look at with clients. GGT is a liver enzyme. And of course, everything that we eat primarily gets directed to the liver. And in particular, obviously, carbohydrates, sugars. And this is where, I'm sure your listeners have probably seen the movie Super Size Me from years ago, when the guy decides to eat nothing but McDonald's for 30 days, I believe it was, every meal of the day. And this is where there's a moment in the movie where the doctor's eyes are kind of bulging as he's looking at the labs for this individual who's only eating McDonald's. And the liver enzymes are through the roof. So his GGT levels are enormous. And this is due to the high processed foods, high simple sugars, etc. And so it's a very early predictor of things going wrong. And so that's kind of a nice one to throw in there. Again, it's very inexpensive. And then the last one would be around inflammation. Systemic inflammation, again, goes part and parcel with with weight gain, with prediabetes, with poor cardiovascular health. And so CRP would be a measure of that. And that's, a pretty easy set of metrics to be able to track, year on year. And then if you are struggling with your health, then you want to track more frequently, maybe a couple times a year. And if you really need to shift things, if you're looking like you're moving into diabetes, or you're really, there's hypertension or whatnot, then you might want to even go quarterly. And always, the first protocol is obviously for the doctors is to compare you to the norms, because they're trying to cross off serious conditions and diseases. But once you're past that threshold, then that's when you want to start comparing you to you every time, and making sure that, are you trending towards disease, or are you trending away from disease? Because obviously we want you to be trending the side that's pulling you away from all those chronic conditions.
Yeah. I go in for wellness visits 3-4 times a year. And I happen to have a really good doctor that kind of understands that just being average is not really what I'm after. And that's not why I pay for additional lab tests. But I'm actually looking for, what's that good thing that I can do for myself to kind of get myself more optimal. And the actions and the things that I do with my health and wellness, they're always kind of directed towards that. You got me really intrigued about the continuous blood glucose monitor. And I was looking it up, and unfortunately I'll have to ask my doctor if he's willing to give me a prescription for one, because you can't just buy it over the counter. But I was really interested in trying one of those out, just to see what it tells me about some of the foods that I'm eating and how they affect me. So thank you for reminding me that those are available. But like I said, I was doing some research after I read that in your book. I was like, oh, I got to get a prescription for this. Which was kind of sad.
Well, I mean, nowadays you could actually even order them. You should just be able to order them online. You get the continuous glucose monitors are a really fascinating way to look into how you personally respond to food. Because, for anyone who's not familiar, they effectively, the back of your arm, it's a little bit of a pinprick that goes in, and this sensor stays on you, continuously for a week or two. And it's basically measuring your response to all the food that you're eating. So how high your blood sugars get when you eat a meal. Importantly, afterwards, how low they get and for how long they stay low. But also things like, if you get a bad email and you're stressed out, well, your blood glucose will respond to that, or maybe you don't sleep enough, and you'll see some big shifts there. So it's definitely a really nice way to see individually how you respond, because in some of the earlier research, someone who ate a banana, let's say, or a piece of fruit that should have a moderate glycemic index response, they were seeing responses as if they'd eaten a cookie. And on the flip side, people who ate a cookie had a really smooth response to blood glucose. And so this is where, depending on our individuality, we actually, you could end up on one side of the coin or the other. And we dive into this a bit in the chapter around digestion, because it looks like the microbiome, all the bacteria in your gut, are having a big impact on how you as an individual are responding to the food you're eating. It can sort of amplify your blood glucose response, in sort of the bad scenario, if you will, or buffer it in people who are, maybe genetically or whatnot lucky.
Yeah, there was an Israeli study that I had read about one time, and they used these continuous monitors and logged everything they ate. So they logged what they ate, the time of day they ate it, and the differential between how different people experience the food from a blood glucose level and then even a recovery perspective afterwards was really kind of fascinating, because everybody just thought, okay, this is the GI of this food, so if you eat it, your blood sugar is going to soar. But that's true for some and not necessarily for others. So I do think testing is really a kind of a cool way for you to really know how things are affecting you, and then it just allows you to make better decisions. Now, a lot of my clients, and a lot of folks that I interact with, they're in the keto environment. I practice seasonal ketosis, and I know, okay, as soon as I go into ketosis for a period of a month or so, my endurance performance is going to be rubbish, for lack of a better word. And then, over time, I pick up that performance. My body gets more metabolically adapted, and I'm able to go. Now, if someone wants to use ketosis, what are some things that they can do to optimize their general performance? In one case, I guess it would be weightlifting, or somewhat for body composition, and then also for endurance athletes.
Yeah, this is a really interesting area in the research, especially as it relates to not only general health, but also in terms of athletic performance. Because when we look at even the highest level, so in endurance sport, cyclists, Tour de France, they're now using in the last half decade or more targeted, planned, strategic workouts where they will have very low carbohydrate intake. And this can be anywhere from 30 to 50% of the workouts where they're on purpose trying to have these workouts where the person's intake of carbohydrate is low and or the glycogen, the storage form of carbs in their muscles is low. And that can be low due to doing 2-a-day sessions. So you maybe do an intense session in the morning, you deplete the glycogen, you don't consume a lot of carbohydrate, and then you have an afternoon aerobic session. Or it could be after a fast. If you sleep at night, you're going to use up the liver glycogen overnight, and in the morning, that liver glycogen is going to be low because your liver also stores carbohydrate in the form of glycogen. And that, again, elicits a different response. So what does all this mean to the person listening in at home? It means you don't always have to carb up for your workouts. If you're trying to be fit and stay lean or be fit and lose weight, then you definitely want to start to take advantage of these opportunities to have workouts where you don't have a lot of carbohydrate. And so I think for a lot of people, the easiest one is that morning workout, right? You go to bed, you wake up in the morning, you might have a coffee, and then off you go. And so again, because your liver glycogen levels are lower, you're going to have a different response at the cellular level, and that can help in terms of training adaptations as well as some beneficial health effects. And so with that, you don't have to go full into a full ketogenic diet to elicit a lot of these benefits. We see in some of these training studies that even a few days of lowered consumption can elicit a lot of these positive effects. If you're somebody who, let's say if you're somebody who's struggling with weight gain, or you're pre-diabetic, or you have a lot of weight to lose, then the more quickly you drop your carbohydrate intake. If you're really trying to get into ketosis, you just need to be careful a little bit because it's going to feel definitely a bit quite intense for you. And so making sure you might pair that up with more lower intensity exercise for that person who's just kind of dipping their toe into it. Whereas someone who's more seasoned, let's say, I recently talked to a guy named Dr. Wes Kephart, who did a study on the ketogenic diet and CrossFit trainees. And these were, moderate to advanced trainees. And, they got very good results in terms of leanness. They maintained muscle mass, and they were obviously doing intense exercise with very low carbohydrate intake. And so you can push it up to that scale if you're more seasoned to it, if you're used to doing it. Yeah, so you definitely got some options on that front. And at the end of the day, as I mentioned before, in looking at all this research, like if we look at bodybuilders, their carbohydrate intake can be up as high as, in the elite ones, up as high as 5 grams per kilo, which is a lot of carbs. So, try not to fall into the trap of thinking that if I just lower my carbs, I'm going to get leaner. It still comes down to these principles, which is what the book's all about as well, which is your total caloric intake. So, ketogenic diets can be a great way to reduce calories. They can be a great way to elicit a lot of these positive adaptations to exercise. But then you need to do a little detective work, just see how you respond, see how you feel with various workouts, and ultimately always know what your goal is as well. Is it to lose weight? Is it to improve your health? Are you really chasing some performance metric that you're after? Because that'll dictate the way that you should do it.
Yeah. You got me thinking in the book as I was going through the book, and I was like, okay, I like when I'm in ketosis, it's kind of almost a natural thing for me to kind of drift into intermittent fasting. I wake up in the morning, I'm just not really hungry. Like you said, I'll probably have a coffee, but I don't do the bulletproof coffee or any of that because it's just black coffee. And then I'll go work out. And I typically do the workout fasted. But you've got me thinking in terms, because you even put that quote in there, breakfast like a king, lunch like a pauper, like a prince, and then dinner like a pauper, which is effectively the kind of the flip scale of the way I would do intermittent fasting. Do we have less general glycogen when we're in ketosis, or does it not recover at some level where we just maintain it? Or exactly how is all that working if I want to, actually, as if I'm lifting or doing endurance endurance work, is obviously you're saying I should just try it and see how it works, or?
So there's a few options here. So let's start with even the intermittent fasting. So there's, an easy way to start people off is to do the idea of not eating breakfast, right? Because again, as we mentioned before, breakfast is typically the meal of the day where there's a lot of bad options on the menu especially if you're eating out. And so I find a lot of my clients, men and women, you just cancel breakfast out altogether. All of a sudden, there's more time in the morning to get some emails done, to call clients or customers, or get the kids
or
out of the house or
meditate,
whatever, or meditate or add a, so you've got more time on your hands all of a sudden. And now you're eating, typically a 16 and 8, technically call this time restricted feeding, which means you're just shrinking the window that you're eating. So you might delay your breakfast till 10 or 11 a.m. And then you're going to eat for about 8 hours. So till 6 or 7 p.m. And then again, you're not going to eat for 16 hours, which sounds like a long time, but you're sleeping hopefully for 7 or 8. So it's not so bad. And so that's one way of reducing the.
Well, no, we know from the book, they should know from the book 8 to 10.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Dr. Sachin Panda's work is, but the interesting thing as well, so that's a one strategy that you can use, and it's an effective strategy. It's no better than caloric, than effectively counting your total caloric intake in a day. There are some different benefits to it, but it is a nice strategy to get people to lose weight. So you can use that for a while. The flip side of that is when you look at a lot of the research on fasting, if you just stop eating at 6 p.m., even if you have breakfast, if you just stop in the evenings to allow that longer period of time, then you'll also get a lot of benefits. So, the big take-home message here is that in today's environment, we eat for 14, 16, 18 hours a day. If the average person is only sleeping 6 hours, we're effectively eating for 18 hours in a day, which is just way too much. So finding a strategy that works for the person to be able to say, we got to shrink that window, because grabbing a snack on your couch at night, if you're watching Game of Thrones or whatever it might be at 9, 10, 11 p.m., those are the opportunities where now when we feed in the evening, that really starts to disrupt circadian rhythms. And, as you mentioned, Dr. Sachin Panda's work at the Salk Institute, and, he found his original research in animals was where all of a sudden, if you fed, animals the same amount of calories, but you allowed one to do it in an 8-hour window and you let the other one just eat all day long, the mice who had access to food 24/7, and they effectively got fatter and sicker. And follow-up studies in humans, and this is just in pre-diabetic men, if you compare to even a 12-hour window to a 6-hour window, you'd actually see that oxidative stress, blood pressure, cravings are all increased in the folks that are eating in the bigger window. So again, another interesting strategy of using that time-restricted feeding, intermittent fasting, to be able to say, hey, if we shrink the amount of hours in the day that you can eat, you're going to tend to eat a lot less calories. And the other big fundamental is if you can try to limit how much you eat late at night. If it's Friday or Saturday night, don't worry about it. We want people to live a little, but it's that, 5 other days of the week where we should just be a bit more vigilant and just get into a good routine and good practice of not eating. Because once we get used to the habit, I mean, it's a bit like Pavlov's dog, where as soon as you sit on the couch at 9 p.m. to watch a show or whatever it might be, all of a sudden you just want to eat something, even though it's sort of mindless eating and reacting, right?
Yeah. And I've seen that, anecdotally with a lot of people I've talked to and worked with, and is if they will go ahead and do that restriction and just start walking their breakfast back, and they get into a shorter window, one, they find that they're satiated better, they're not snacking as often, they're having better meals, and they lose weight. It happens time and time again, and they just feel better. I think that's the other side of it, is when your body's not constantly working to deal with the food, you're sleeping better, you're feeling better, and you get used to that new way of eating, that I think is probably a lot more ancestral than we would think. Because you wake up in the morning, if you don't have refrigeration, and you didn't have boxed foods, there's no milk and there's no cereal. When you wake up first thing in the morning, you got to go catch or forage for what you're going to eat. And by that time, it's probably a little later in the day.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that, we've only really eaten 3 meals a day for sort of the last century or so since the Industrial Revolution. So that's one that, it's definitely an interesting note. And one of the things that I found in my practice is guys and gals do great with the intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding, delaying breakfast for the first while. If they do hit a roadblock at some point down the line, their weight loss is plateaued or they haven't achieved the goal they want, if they just flip it and kind of do the reverse way of what we just discussed, which is having breakfast, lunch, but making the dinner earlier, cutting things off at 6 p.m. is a great way to, again, see some more progress. The trickiest part is that our society today doesn't tend to lend itself to trying not to eat after 6 p.m. because, it's normally like meetings, family dinners, social events, everything happens at night. So that's a trickier one to actually get people to do, but they can get some great success with that as well.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Bubbs, I define wellness as being the healthiest, fittest, and happiest you can be. What are 3 strategies or tactics to get and stay well?
That's a great question. I mean, this is where, in writing the book, it's a combination of my work in elite sport and my work in clinical practicing, all types of patients. And it does come back to this idea of we want to really focus on the fundamentals. So even complex problems that I see with the general population or athletes are struggling, when we go back and look at these big pillars, there's still a ways to go, or sometimes it's just the fact that the person's taken their focus off of them and they've sort of dipped off a little bit. So we're looking at 3 things. The first one's going to be nutrition. What are we doing and what are we consuming? And so again, based on today's talk, avoiding ultra processed food. So eat real food, whether, animal protein or vegetable protein, veggies, healthy oils and fats. Those are crucial to have it. If you eat mostly that and try to keep that eating window to, a maximum of 12 hours, that's a great first place to start. You're going to improve your health. You're going to lose weight. And the more you need to do that, then you can refine that as you go. Number 2 is going to be sleep. Sleep dovetails in with stress. And when we look at whether it's athletic performance, cognitive function, overall health, sleep correlates to all these things. And so most people now sort of, they give you the, I know, I should get more sleep. But you need to, if it's a listener at home or a coach or a clinician listening in, we need to find out how much they're actually sleeping and then hold them accountable to say, hey, every week we're going to add 30 minutes. So if you're only getting 6, we got to get you to 6.5. And then the next week, we got to get you to 7. And as long as you're in that range of 7 to 9, which is a National Sleep Foundation recommendation, typically I like to see people about 8, and giving them some strategies. Because again, people will tend to work on their laptop before bed. People will tend to watch programs that are really stimulatory at night. People will tend to do things that don't set them up for sleep. So layering in, whether it's some relaxing work, some stretching, some hot bath or shower, meditation, any kind of those practices is really big as well. So once you got that nutrition, sleep, the third one for me is going to be movement. And this is one where when we talk about weight loss, we always think about the hour that we're in the gym in the day. We don't tend to think about the other, well, not quite 23 hours, because hopefully you're sleeping for those 8, but the rest of the day, which in the research you call non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And that's just the amount of moving you do in the day. The walking around up and down the stairs, around the office, that accounts for a massive portion of your ability to lose weight. And when we look at, hunter-gatherer populations or before the Industrial Revolution, we were far, far, far more physical and doing things. When we look at the blue zones today, all of those areas in the world where people live the longest, that's a huge common area amongst all of them, is the fact that they all had to move and be physical and go up and down, whether it's mountains or et cetera. So make sure there's movement in your day, whether that's 10,000 steps, whether that's carrying the groceries home, whatever it might be, to start spending less time being sedentary and more time being active is definitely a huge part. And if you can tie that in with some aspect of being, of community or friends, it's a walk with your friend or meeting somebody for a coffee or, whatever it might be. I had one client, actually, I got him to every morning, rather than have his coffee at home. He's a retired guy. He was pretty fit, but still had to improve his health. And we just got him to go walk 15 minutes to get his coffee and walk back home. And that was enough to start then shifting things a little bit and improving his health. So anything that you can layer in that just becomes part of your routine that, in a few months' time, you don't even think about anymore because it's just so second nature, that's when you're really going to get some of these big wins to help achieve your goals.
Those are really, really cool. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing those. So Dr. Bubbs, if someone wanted to get in touch with you, learn more about your book, Peak, and the things that you're doing, where would you like for me to send them?
Absolutely. Well, listen, it's a pleasure to be on, Alan. They can definitely check out the book's available, Peak, at all the major bookstores, so Barnes & Noble, Chapters Indigo, Amazon, local book retailers. They can also check out my work at drbubbs.com. My podcast as well is on there, Dr. Bubbs Performance Podcast. And if they're on social media, at Dr. Bubbs, Bubbs on Twitter, Instagram, all those good things.
Cool. So Dr. Bubbs, thank you so much for being a part of 40 Plus Fitness.
Fantastic, Alan. Listen, I really appreciate it.
I hope you took something wonderful from today's show. And if you did, would you help me spread the word about this podcast? There are two ways that you can do this. One is you can tell your friends and family about it and show them how they can subscribe to this podcast, or you can sport a wonderful 40 Plus Fitness Podcast t-shirt or tank top. I'm working through a company called Teespring. You can go to 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/store, and that'll take you to our Teespring storefront that'll allow you to buy t-shirts, tank tops, coffee mugs, and a lot more. So just go to 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/store and get your 40 Plus Fitness gear today. Next time on the 40 Plus Fitness Podcast, we meet Tal Ben-Shahar and discuss his book, Shortcuts to Happiness. Until then, have a happy and healthy week.